Story 1. This story was sent to me by Sarah Mitchell via email. I thought I was going to die that night, trapped in a cabin with strangers who had been watching us for hours. The sound of footsteps circling our cabin still haunts me, but let me back up and tell you how this all started. My college friends and I had planned this weekend getaway to celebrate finishing our finals. We found this rustic cabin rental in the mountains of Colorado through a sketchy website that was way cheaper than anything on the mainstream platforms. The owner, Frank, seemed friendly enough over the phone, though he insisted on meeting us in person to hand over the keys rather than using a lockbox like most places do nowadays. When we arrived at the designated meeting spot, a gas station about 10 miles from the cabin, Frank was waiting in a beat-up pickup truck. He was probably in his 60s, wearing stained overalls, and had this way of staring just a little too long when he talked to my friend Jessica. He handed me a hand-drawn map to the cabin since GPS apparently didn't work well in that area, and mentioned that his brother and nephew lived nearby and might stop by to check on us. The cabin itself was more isolated than we expected. The dirt road leading to it wound through dense forest for about 3 miles, and there wasn't another building in sight. The cabin was small but clean enough, with 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a living area with a stone fireplace. What made me uncomfortable was that there were no curtains on any of the windows, and Frank explained that the previous guests had taken them down and he hadn't gotten around to replacing them yet. That first night went fine, but I kept feeling like we were being watched. Every time I glanced toward the dark windows, I had this creeping sensation that someone was out there. My friends laughed it off when I mentioned it, saying I was just paranoid because of all the horror movies we'd been watching during finals week. The second day, we decided to hike to a nearby waterfall that Frank had marked on his map. We left around noon and planned to be back before dark. The hike took longer than expected, and by the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was setting. That's when I noticed the first real red flag. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt near our car, and they definitely weren't from Frank's truck. Jessica pointed out that someone had moved our cooler from the porch to a different spot near the door. We'd left it in the shade on the left side, but now it was sitting in front of the steps. When we went inside, things felt off. Not obviously disturbed, but little things were different. A magazine that had been on the coffee table was now on the kitchen counter. The bathroom door, which we always left open, was closed. My friend Mike said we were being paranoid, but I could tell everyone was on edge. We decided to drive in town for dinner instead of cooking at the cabin, just to get away for a while and hopefully shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we got back around 10 p.m., there was a pickup truck parked at the end of our driveway. Not Frank's truck, this one was newer and black. As our headlights hit it, the truck immediately started up and drove away without turning on its lights. That's when we all knew something was seriously wrong. Inside the cabin, we discovered that someone had definitely been there while we were gone. Our belongings had been gone through, not ransacked, but carefully examined. Someone had looked through our bags, our phones were in different positions, and most disturbing of all, there were muddy footprints throughout the cabin that definitely weren't ours. We immediately called Frank, but his phone went straight to voicemail. We tried calling the police, but our cell service was so spotty that the call kept dropping. The landline in the cabin had been disconnected. The phone was there, but when you picked it up, there was no dial tone. That's when Mike suggested we just pack up and leave. But when we went outside to load our car, we discovered that someone had slashed 2 of our tires, deep, deliberate cuts that would make driving impossible. We were stranded, and whoever had done this was probably still nearby, watching us figure out our situation. We went back inside and tried to secure the cabin as best we could. We moved furniture in front of the door and checked all the windows, but most of them didn't have proper locks. The back door had a flimsy latch that could probably be kicked in without much effort. We turned off all the lights and tried to stay quiet, hoping that whoever was out there would just leave. Around midnight, we heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. They would stop for a few minutes, then start again from a different direction. Someone was out there, walking around our cabin, taking their time, like they were studying the building or maybe trying to figure out the best way to get inside. Jessica was crying quietly, and Mike was gripping a kitchen knife he'd found in one of the drawers. I was crouched by the front window, trying to see outside without being seen. That's when I saw the flashlight beam sweep across the yard. There wasn't just one person out there. I could see at least 2 different lights moving in different patterns. The footsteps stopped right outside the front door. We could hear someone testing the handle, turning it slowly. The furniture we'd piled against the door shifted slightly as someone pushed from the outside. Then we heard voices, men talking in low tones, but we couldn't make out what they were saying. For the next 2 hours, they circled the cabin periodically. Sometimes the footsteps would stop for 20 or 30 minutes, and we'd think they were gone, but then they'd start again. At one point, someone tried the back door, and we heard them rattling the windows on the side of the cabin. Around 3 a.m., we heard vehicles starting up, multiple engines, and then the sound of trucks driving down the dirt road. We waited another hour before any of us dared to move from our hiding spots. When dawn finally came, we carefully looked outside and saw that our car had been vandalized further. All 4 tires slashed now, and someone had scratched deep gouges into the paint. We ended up hiking out to the main road, which took about 4 hours through the forest. A passing motorist picked us up and drove us to the nearest town, where we called the police. When the officers went to investigate the cabin, they found evidence that the place had been used as some kind of surveillance post. There were cigarette butts, food wrappers, and makeshift seating areas in the woods around the cabin where someone had been watching the place for an extended period. The police told us that Frank wasn't actually the real owner of the cabin. The property belonged to someone else entirely, and Frank had been illegally renting it out to unsuspecting tourists. They suspected he was working with local criminals who would rob the guests, and our situation had apparently escalated because we'd stayed longer than they expected. We never found out what would have happened if we hadn't barricaded ourselves inside that night, but the police detective mentioned that there had been other incidents in the area involving missing tourists. I still get anxious when I'm in remote locations, and I always research rental properties thoroughly now. That experience taught me that sometimes the real monsters aren't supernatural. They're just people with bad intentions who know you're isolated and vulnerable. Story 2. I found this on a Reddit thread by user mountainhiker92. The man standing in our cabin doorway at 2 in the morning wasn't someone we'd invited, and he had keys to every lock in the place. But let me back up and tell you how we ended up in this nightmare situation. My husband and I had booked a cabin in upstate New York for our anniversary weekend. It was one of those luxury rental places you see on Instagram, all exposed beams and floor-to-ceiling windows perched on a hillside overlooking a lake. The photos showed a modern, secure-looking place with electronic locks and a security system. We were particularly drawn to how private it seemed, surrounded by acres of forest with no neighboring properties visible. The check-in process was entirely digital. We received a code for the front door via text message, and the rental company's instructions said the cabin would be fully stocked and ready for our arrival. When we got there Friday evening, everything seemed perfect. The place was even more beautiful than the photos, spotlessly clean, and the view of the lake at sunset was breathtaking. We spent Saturday hiking the trails around the property and enjoying the hot tub on the deck. The isolation felt romantic and peaceful. The closest neighbor was supposedly 3 miles away, and we'd passed maybe 2 other cars on the winding road leading to the cabin. We grilled dinner outside and watched the stars, feeling like we'd found the perfect escape from city life. That night, we went to bed around 11 p.m. The master bedroom was on the 2nd floor, with huge windows facing the lake. We'd left the curtains open because the view was so spectacular, and we figured we were completely alone anyway. I fell asleep easily, exhausted from the hiking and fresh mountain air. I woke up around 1:30 a.m. to the sound of a door closing somewhere in the cabin. At first, I thought it might be the wind or the house settling, but then I heard distinct footsteps on the hardwood floor downstairs. My husband was still fast asleep beside me, and I lay there frozen, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The footsteps moved slowly through the cabin, like someone was familiar with the layout. I heard what sounded like cabinet doors opening and closing in the kitchen, and then the distinctive creak of the refrigerator door. Someone was downstairs, moving around casually like they belonged there. I shook my husband awake and whispered what I was hearing. At first, he was groggy and didn't believe me, but then we both heard the footsteps moving toward the staircase. Heavy boots on the wooden steps, coming up slowly, deliberately. We both realized at the same time that we were trapped in the bedroom with nowhere to go. The only exit was past whoever was coming upstairs. My husband grabbed his phone to call 911, but there was no cell service. We'd noticed the spotty coverage when we arrived, but hadn't thought it would be a problem. The landline we'd seen downstairs might as well have been on another planet. We heard the footsteps reach the top of the stairs and stopped. For about 10 minutes, nothing happened. No movement, no sound. We sat in bed, barely breathing, wondering if the person was still there or if they'd somehow left without us hearing. Then we heard someone trying the handle of the bedroom door, slowly turning it back and forth, testing whether it was locked. Thank God my husband had thrown the deadbolt before we went to sleep, something he always did out of habit, even though we'd felt completely safe. That's when we heard the keys. The sound of metal keys jingling right outside our door made my blood run cold. Whoever was out there had keys to the cabin. They tried several different keys before finding one that worked. We heard the deadbolt turning, and then the door slowly swung open. The man standing in our doorway was maybe 40 years old, average height, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap. He had a flashlight in one hand and a ring of keys in the other. When he saw us sitting up in bed, he didn't seem surprised or startled. He just stood there, looking at us with this expression like he was mildly annoyed that we were awake. "You folks need to get dressed and come downstairs," he said, in a calm voice, like this was a completely normal situation. My husband asked who he was and what he wanted, trying to keep his voice steady. The man said his name was Dennis and that he worked for the property management company. He claimed there had been a double booking error and that the real guests were arriving in the morning, so we needed to leave. Something about his story didn't add up. Why would he show up at 2 in the morning? Why did he have keys to the deadbolt on the bedroom door? And there was something in his eyes that made every instinct I had scream danger. he kept glancing at me in a way that made my skin crawl. My husband told him we'd call the rental company in the morning to sort it out, but we weren't leaving in the middle of the night. That's when Dennis's demeanor changed completely. His friendly mask dropped and he stepped into the room. "I'm trying to be nice about this," he said, "but you're leaving one way or another." He moved toward the bed, and that's when my husband lunged at him. They struggled for a few seconds before Dennis stumbled backward into the hallway. My husband slammed the door and threw the deadbolt again, but we both knew it wouldn't stop him since he had keys. "There's more of us," Dennis called through the door, "and we know these woods better than you do. Make this easy on yourselves." We could hear him talking to someone else in the hallway, multiple male voices discussing something in low tones. My husband was looking around the room frantically for an escape route. The windows were our only option, but we were on the second floor, and it was at least a 15-foot drop to the ground below. We heard Dennis trying his keys again, so my husband opened the window and told me to climb out. The roof over the first floor deck extended below our window, and if we could get onto it, we might be able to jump down from there. I went first, trying to lower myself as quietly as possible while my husband held my hands. Just as my feet touched the roof, we heard the bedroom door open behind us. Dennis was back inside, and he was angry. My husband practically dove out the window as Dennis rushed toward us. We both slipped and slid down the roof, landing hard on the deck below, but we were okay. We ran to our car, but when my husband tried to start it, nothing happened. They disabled it somehow. We could hear Dennis and at least one other man coming around the side of the cabin, so we ran into the forest. We spent the rest of the night hiding in the woods, moving whenever we heard voices or saw flashlight beams searching for us. When the sun came up, we hiked towards the main road. It took us almost 3 hours to reach a house where we could call for help. The police investigation revealed that Dennis and his accomplices had been using several rental properties in the area for robbery schemes. They'd pose as property managers or maintenance workers to gain access to cabins where tourists were staying alone. The rental company had no record of Dennis working for them, and they were horrified to learn that somehow he'd gotten master keys to their properties. We later found out that at least 6 other couples had been robbed using the same method, though we were the first ones who'd fought back and escaped. The police caught Dennis and 2 other men a few weeks later when they tried the same scam on an off-duty police officer and his wife. We learned that if we hadn't run when we did, they planned to tie us up and rob us, then leave us in the cabin for housekeeping to find the next day. The detective said we were lucky that my husband had locked the bedroom door and that we'd been willing to jump from the roof. I still love the mountains, but we never stay in isolated rentals anymore, and I always verify that anyone claiming to work for a property management company is actually on their official staff roster. That night taught me that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who seem to have legitimate reasons for being where they are. Story 2. This was shared with me on Instagram by Jake Adventures 23. The family that owned the cabin had been dead for 3 months, but no one bothered to tell us before we showed up for our weekend rental. Let me back up and explain how we walked into this horrifying situation. My girlfriend Emma and I were looking for a cheap weekend getaway in the Adirondacks. We found this listing on a lesser-known rental site for a cabin that was about half the price of anything comparable in the area. The photos showed a cozy log cabin with a wraparound porch, and the description mentioned it was a family property that had been passed down for generations. The booking process was handled entirely through email with someone named Robert, who said he was managing the property for his elderly aunt. He was very accommodating about our dates and payment, though he did insist on cash payment when we arrived. He said his aunt was old-fashioned and didn't trust credit card companies. When we arrived Friday afternoon, Robert was waiting for us in the driveway. He was maybe 35, clean-cut, and seemed normal enough, though he was extremely nervous. His hands were shaking when he showed us around the cabin. Story 3. Someone DM'd me this on Twitter. I realized we'd been sleeping in a cabin with unlocked doors for 2 nights while dangerous men used it as their base of operations, and we had no idea until we found their stash. But let me back up and explain how we stumbled into this terrifying situation. My 3 buddies and I had planned a guy's fishing trip to a remote lake in northern Michigan. We found a cabin rental that was perfect for our needs, right on the water with a boat dock and cleaning station for fish. The owner, an older guy named Chuck, met us at the property to show us around and give us the keys. Chuck seemed like a typical outdoorsman, friendly and knowledgeable about the best fishing spots on the lake. He mentioned that the cabin didn't get much use during the week since it was so far from town, but weekends were usually booked solid during fishing season. He pointed out that the nearest neighbor was about 2 miles through the woods, so we'd have complete privacy. The cabin was basic but comfortable, with 4 single beds in 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen with everything we needed, and a living room with a stone fireplace. Chuck showed us how to work the generator and warned us that the power sometimes went out during storms. He gave us his phone number and said to call if we had any problems, though he mentioned that cell service was unreliable and we might need to drive toward town to get a signal. Our first 2 days were exactly what we'd hoped for. We caught plenty of fish, cooked them over the fire, and spent the evenings playing cards and telling stories. The isolation was perfect for what we wanted. No distractions, no internet, just 4 friends enjoying the outdoors like we'd done since college. On Sunday morning, my friend Dave decided to explore the woods behind the cabin while the rest of us were cleaning our gear. He came back about an hour later with a strange expression on his face. He pulled me aside and said he'd found something disturbing about a 1/4 mile into the forest. Dave led me to a spot where someone had built a makeshift camp, a tarp stretched between trees, a fire ring, and several crates hidden under camouflage netting. When we looked inside the crates, we found things that made no sense for a camping setup. Burner phones still in packaging, stacks of cash in rubber bands, plastic bags full of what looked like prescription pills, and detailed maps of the local area with several cabins marked in red ink. The most disturbing thing was a notebook filled with handwritten observations about the comings and goings of different properties. Our cabin was listed, along with notes about when guests typically arrived and left, how many cars they drove, and whether they looked like they had money. Someone had been watching the rental properties in the area and documenting the habits of tourists. We realized we needed to get out of there immediately. If this was some kind of criminal operation, we didn't want to be anywhere near it when the people came back. But as we were hiking back toward the cabin, Dave grabbed my arm and pointed through the trees. There was a pickup truck parked behind our cabin that hadn't been there when we left. We crept closer and saw 2 men we didn't recognize loading equipment from the cabin into their truck. They were moving efficiently, like they'd done this before, taking things from inside and carrying them to their vehicle. One of them was older, maybe 50, wearing hunting gear. The other was younger and had the kind of build that suggested he was used to physical confrontation. My friend Tom was back at the cabin, and we had no way to warn him without exposing ourselves. We watched as the men finished loading their truck and went back inside the cabin. We could hear voices through the windows, but couldn't make out what they were saying. After about 20 minutes, they came back outside and drove away down the main road. We waited another 30 minutes before approaching the cabin. When we got inside, we found Tom tied up in one of the bedrooms, duct tape over his mouth, but he was unharmed. The men had surprised him while he was taking a shower and told them they needed to use the cabin for a few hours. They'd tied him up to keep him quiet, but they hadn't hurt him or stolen anything obvious. Tom said they'd asked him detailed questions about our group, how long we were staying, whether we'd told anyone exactly where we were, and whether we had expensive equipment with us. They seemed particularly interested in whether we'd explored the woods around the cabin or noticed anything unusual. We packed everything immediately and drove toward town. When we finally got cell service, we called the police and reported what we'd found. The investigation revealed that the criminals had been using several remote cabin rentals as storage and meeting locations for a drug distribution network. They'd specifically chosen properties that were isolated and only occupied on weekends. Chuck, the cabin owner, had no idea his property was being used this way. The criminals had copied his keys months earlier when they'd posed as maintenance workers, and they'd been coming and going freely whenever the cabin was empty. They'd been careful to only use the place when they knew guests weren't scheduled to arrive. The police found the camp in the woods and several other stash locations throughout the area. They arrested 5 men in connection with the operation, including the 2 who'd confronted Tom at the cabin. The detective told us that if we'd stayed another night, we probably would have encountered the full group when they came to move their supplies. What scared me most was realizing that we'd been completely vulnerable for 2 nights without knowing it. These men had keys to every door in the cabin, they knew our schedule, and they'd been watching us the entire time. We'd been sleeping peacefully while dangerous criminals were using our temporary home as their base of operations. The experience changed how I think about remote rentals completely. Now I always ask property owners about who else has access to keys, and I pay attention to signs that a place might be used for purposes other than what it's advertised for. Sometimes the most dangerous situations are the ones where you don't even realize you're in danger until it's almost too late.